Okay, I know the title looks like it was made by a 12-year-old, but let's not kid ourselves here. Soulsborne games have some of the coolest fucking bosses in all of video games. And before we jump into the video, I just want to take a second to show you my credentials here. Yup, I platinumed all of them. And I even platinumed the damn mech game because I'm just that much of a FromSoft fanboy. Now, I wanted to show you this for two reasons. One, to flex on the haters, obviously. And number two, I want to prove that I'm not some fuck at Watch Mojo who's just putting out his list of the day without not even knowing if he's even played the games. I've beaten all of the bosses in these games multiple times, and I put an autistic amount of thought into making this list. But anyway, in this video, I want to go over what I think is the coolest boss fight in every single Soulsborne game. So Demon Souls all the way up to Elden Ring. And since the word cool is kind of subjective and silly, the factors that I'm going to be taking into consideration are the lore behind the boss, the setting of the fight, the appearance of the boss, and the fight mechanics itself. So, while the Dragon God from Demon Souls is badass, the fight has an obnoxious stealth gimmick the entire time, so that prevents it from beating out its competition. And of course, a coolest bosses list is obviously just my opinion. So while I did consider every single boss, let me know in the comments if you think another one edges out any of my picks, because some of these were definitely really close decisions. Especially Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, because they just have so many cool boss fights inside of them. But let's kick off our list with Demon Souls. Now this one was actually a pretty easy decision since a lot of the Demon Souls fights are against disgusting looking demons. And the main challenge of the game is usually the level itself rather than the actual boss at the end of it, which is exactly what makes the next boss stand out so much. The Penetrator. This badass was originally a knight of King Allant, and when the king released demons throughout the kingdom, he remained at guard near the palace, killing any men or demons that attempted to stop the king. But at some point, he himself became corrupted and turned into a demon, which we of course know as the Penetrator. And between his awesome armor and glowing red sword, I don't think I need to convince you on how cool this guy looks. In fact, everybody thought that he was so cool that they actually added his armor set into the remake because of how upset everyone was that they couldn't get it in the original game. He's also much more aggressive than most of the other bosses inside of Demon Souls, which makes him noticeably more difficult than the rest of the competition. The boss arena is pretty straightforward, it's just kind of a rectangle with statues towards the center. He also gets an infinite amount of aura points for stabbing this annoying piece of shit when he's introduced. So yeah, coolest fight in Demon Souls I definitely have to give to the Penetrator, with not much competition to be honest. So let's move on to what is my favorite Dark Souls game. Okay, Dark Souls 1 is where it starts to get tough to choose the coolest boss. My heart immediately wants to say Gwyn because he's one of my favorite boss fights of all time, but when I look at my own qualifications for what a cool boss fight is, there's only one person that fits the bill, and that is Artorias the Abyss Walker. He was originally a knight of Gwyn and was so powerful and trusted that Gwyn offered him a fragment of his Lord Soul. And eventually Artorias met a great grey wolf named Sif, and the two forged a deep bond together, not as just master and pet, but actual comrades. Sif even learned how to use a greatsword in a very Zorro-like fashion to help his friend. And very long story short, darkness was spreading from an abyss deep underground, so Gwyn ordered Artorias to stop it so it wouldn't end his prosperous age of fire. So Artorias and Sif went together to stop the father of Abyss himself, Manus. But unfortunately, Artorias did not prove strong enough and lost the fight. He began to feel himself becoming corrupted by the Abyss, so in one last selfless act of love for his friend, he used his great shield to cast a barrier around Sif. This barrier at least made sure that the Abyss would not take his friend Sif too. And eventually he did lose himself and give in to the Abyss. So when you eventually reach him, the boss fight is almost seen like an act of mercy, putting down this brave knight who gave his life for his wolf friend and the kingdom that he loved so much. And despite this boss being in the DLC, you see him mentioned throughout the entire base game because of his reputation. And another boss fight that I don't even want to talk about right now. The fight itself also takes place inside of a ruined Colosseum, which seems like such a fitting place to fight this corrupted hero. And as he is of course corrupted by the Abyss, he fights very similar to yourself, but much more animalistic. Even if you didn't pay attention to any of the lore, you would immediately be able to tell that this knight is not himself and is being controlled by something. He also has one of the coolest armor sets in the entire series. So with all of that, along with the fight being such a fun battle against an important figure, Artorias definitely wins the position of coolest boss fight in Dark Souls 1. Sorry, Bed of Chaos, but not in a million fucking years. Now let's move on to a game that I love very dearly despite what everyone says, Dark Souls 2. Now even though I love Dark Souls 2, it definitely has a quantity over quality philosophy when it comes to the bosses. So while there are a whopping 41 bosses total, my final picks came down to just 3. So I wanted to give a super quick special shout out to Sir Alan, who does this when you kill him without taking damage. And also the Burnt Ivory King, who is a very close second, having one of the coolest arenas in the entire series. And also one of my favorite Souls tropes of falling a massive distance into a hole to fight the boss in its arena. But after a lot of consideration, I have to give it to Dark Lurker. Now, like my other choices, this is probably where I would tell you about the lore of the boss. But that's the cool thing with Dark Lurker, we really don't have much to work with. And while it's not uncommon to not understand the boss you're fighting in this series, it is uncommon for him not to have any definitive answer 10 years later, which really makes him stand out to me as a lore nerd. So unlike the other bosses, this is going to be me speculating based on my own observations. The fight itself is entirely optional and takes place in the Chasm of Old when you reach the end of the Pilgrims of the Dark Covenant quest. So yeah, usual Souls super hidden shit. But this chasm is the remnants of the Abyss from Dark Souls 1. So I believe that this being is some form influenced or created by Manus, or more likely, the Four Kings, which would definitely explain his ability to multiply. Another interesting theory that I found online suggests that it is actually a mana, as in Shrine of Amana, as in one of the meanest areas of the game. When you look at Dark Lurker's design, it's almost like some kind of four-armed angel with no face. It uses magic throughout the fight in many different ways, from creating a sword, conjuring fireballs, or, like I mentioned earlier, creating copies of himself towards the end of the fight, which is just fucking pure chaos. And all of these things make Dark Lurker one of the most intense and difficult fights in all of Dark Souls 2, and one of the most mysterious fights in the whole series, which in my book definitely earns him the title as the coolest boss fight inside of Dark Souls 2. And now let's move on to a game that Sony seems to hate for some reason, Bloodborne. Now this game has some cool fucking bosses, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. The lack of defensive options in Bloodborne compared to Dark Souls leads to boss fights that are so much more faster paced than any of FromSoft's previous games. And I'm sorry Lady Maria fans, it was really close, but the title has to go to my man Ludwig.
Please, help us. An unsightly beast. The great terror looms. Have mercy. Have mercy upon us.
Now, Ludwig was the first hunter of the Healing Church. likely being a cleric since most members of the Healing Church are. And in some sad twist of fate, the clerics usually end up becoming the most hideous beasts in the game, to which Ludwig is definitely no exception. But Ludwig trained and united many of the people of Yharnam against the Scourge, and eventually came across his staple Holy Blade. This allowed him to channel the cosmos, and interestingly enough, it's also implied to be sentient, so this likely influenced Ludwig as time went on. And eventually, as he continued his beast killing, some of the people began to doubt his real intentions. This fear would be proven as he eventually gave in to his bloodlust and turned into a disgusting horse-like beast, slaughtering anyone who enters or comes near his underground corpse pile, being entirely responsible for that long river of blood that the hunter navigates throughout the beginning of the dream. And as we enter the arena, we see one of these corpses begging for help until Ludwig shows himself, and is seemingly completely taken by his beast transformation, not showing any kind of humanity left. However, once you enter his second phase, you see his sword start glowing, and it seems like some of his humanity has started to come back to him. The sentient sword likely snapped him out of it in order to ensure his survival. And then, all of a sudden, the fight with a mindless beast turns into a fight with an old legendary hunter that's just trapped inside of a beast's body. And he begins swinging his sword around, all while one of the best boss themes plays in the background. And much like Artorias, you hear Ludwig's name mentioned throughout the entire base game until he's finally confronted inside of the DLC. And I really love when they do this because it makes the confrontation so meaningful and shocking, seeing what such a legendary hunter has become, with the arena full of mangled corpses really driving that point home. And this, along with an insanely intense boss fight, gives Ludwig the prestigious title of being the coolest boss in all of Bloodborne. And now we move on to the final game in the Dark Souls series. Okay, now this decision was like impossible. Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring definitely have the most consistently great bosses in the series, so picking only one coolest fight is really hard. So I want to give a really quick shout out to the two closest contenders for the top spot. The Nameless King fight is definitely the coolest fight in the base game, and as a Gwyn fanboy, it hurts not to put him or his son at number 1 on these lists, but there's just way too much competition. And it's the same thing with Midir. He's still my favorite dragon fight in the entire Souls series. And he even has that big drop into the boss arena that I really like. But no matter which way I thought about it, I really cannot justify choosing anyone but Gale.
What? Still here? Hand it over, that thing, your dark soul. For my lady's painting.
Now Gale's lore goes deep. My lore write-up for him was originally 3 pages long, but I'm going to try and summarize it as best as I can. Gale himself was originally a slave knight, which unsurprisingly were used as fodder inside of battles. But at some point, Gale managed to escape into the painted world of Ariandel. Inside this world, he met a painter who was just some little girl. The two spent a lot of time together and eventually grew really close, with her even affectionately referring to him as Uncle Gale. However, her and many of the people of this world knew that the painting would one day rot and they would have to burn it in order to recreate the world once again. But another woman named Sister Fried made her way into the world at some point, and she eventually became attached to this place along with its people. And a lot like Gwyn in the real world, she refused to allow nature to run its course. So she declared that the painting would not be burned and punished or locked away anyone who disagreed with her, including the painter girl. Thankfully, Gale managed to escape though. All he had was a rotted piece of the painting and he needed to find an ashen one to burn the rot. And thankfully, he runs into you. He convinces you to touch the painting and you both end up going back inside. You also help him defeat Sister Fried in order to fulfill his and the painter's wishes. However, the girl decides that she wants to create a colder and gentler place than the current painted world. But in order to do this, she needs blood of the Dark Soul, the primordial Lord Soul that the furtive pygmy found back in Dark Souls 1. And Gale, of course, offers to help find the Dark Soul, knowing full well that he is not a champion and the Dark Soul would likely kill him even if he did find it. But despite this, he travels across centuries and fights in countless battles until he eventually reaches the Ringed City and the end of the world itself, which is nothing but dust and ash. It's here that he does find holders of the Dark Soul, but their blood dried up long ago, making them useless for his quest. In his hopelessness, he begins frantically slaughtering them and drinks their dried Dark Soul from their body in order to infuse it into his own blood. Unsurprisingly though, he is not able to handle the Dark Soul and is driven mad by the process. So when the Ashen One reunites with Gale, he demands for your portion of the Dark Soul and of course begins to fight you for it. Whew, that was a lot of lore. And that was the abridged version too. But yeah, everything about this fight is fucking incredible. The fact that it takes place at the end of the world, the way that this nobody has attained this kind of power, and the fact that you helped him complete his mission only for it to end up like this. This fight is also the most fun in the game mechanically too. Many Souls bosses will have you simply dodging and getting some hits in every now and then, but Gale really seems to react to your attacks rather than just doing a set pattern. So you really just feel like you're fighting your equal at the end of the world itself. So yeah, I think they reach peak fucking coolness here. And after you kill him, you can give his blood with the Dark Soul to the painter to finally fulfill his mission for him after his death. So yeah, if it wasn't already obvious, this is my favorite boss fight in the Souls games, and I look forward to it every single time I replay Dark Souls 3. Without a doubt, the crown has to go to Gale. And now let's move on to the game that strikes fear into those who never bothered to actually get good at Souls games. Sekiro! I really adore this game. It was also the first time that a FromSoft title has ever won Game of the Year, which is a massive accomplishment for a difficult game like this. And similar to my Demon Souls pick, this is another one where I had no hesitation in who was the coolest fight in the game. I have to give it to what I believe is the best final boss ever made, Ishin the Sword Saint.
Pitiful grandchild. This was your last wish. To see Ashina returned from the great beyond. Which means Sekiro.
While he was a force of nature in his youth, by the time you meet him, he's a very old and sickly man. Ishin himself actually helps Wolf throughout his journey and proves himself to be a genuinely kind person. His grandson, however, acts as the main antagonist throughout most of your journey. Genichiro aims to achieve immortality by using the young lord's blood, an idea which Ishin adamantly disagrees with. So much so that he decides to help Wolf rather than his grandson. However, towards the end of the game, he does eventually give in to this sickness and dies. But at the very end of the game, in the final confrontation with Genichiro, he realizes that he is no match for Wolf. So in his last moments, he sacrifices himself to bring back his grandfather Ishin in his prime to finish his mission and kill you. And whether the act of resurrecting him binded their wills together, or he is just simply respecting his grandson's final sacrifice, he fights you at full strength in this beautiful flower field. And I know saying that he is the best final boss ever might be a little bit crazy of a statement, so let me explain. Ishin puts every single thing you learn throughout the game to the test. Whether it's using a Makiri counter against his spear, jumping over his sweep attacks, channeling lightning back at him, parrying his onslaught of sword attacks. I mean, fuck, he even whips out a Glock that you need to deflect. And these are all mechanics present in fights throughout the entire game, but Ishin demands that you master all of these. It is an incredibly long battle with 3 health bars. 4 if you count Genichiro, so you will not be able to squeeze by this fight by getting a lucky run or summoning Chad Mimictyr himself. And what should a final boss be if not someone who requires you to master everything you've learned up to that point in the game in order to defeat him? And while I can beat him without that much trouble now, I still remember the feeling that I had when I finally beat him for the first time after hours of attempts. There will not be any doubt in your mind that you earned that victory. And I still have not felt that sense of accomplishment from any video game since I played Sekiro for the first time. And that is what makes Isshin the Sword Saint the coolest fight in all of Sekiro. And now, it's finally time to get to the new kid on the block. Elden Ring. And like I mentioned earlier, Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 were the hardest one to choose only one coolest boss. The highlights of the base game for me was Estelle and of course Malenia, Blade of Mikola, who has never known defeat, blah blah blah, we've all heard it a million times. But FromSoft somehow does not miss with the DLC bosses, and that's where all of our finalists are. The first honorable mention being the Divine Beast Dancing Lion, who has one of the best intros for any boss in the series.
Cleanse away this strumpet's fire.
And of course, Prime Radahn for obvious reasons. But since I am also considering the fight itself, he did get pushed out. I honestly love how strong and broken he is, but I can't honestly say that I have fun actually fighting him. All of the bosses prior to this feel almost like a dance with a really strong enemy, while Prime Radahn feels more like getting punched in the face over and over. So that leaves us with everyone's favorite mama's boy, Messmer the Impaler.
Mongrel intruder. That tarnished, it seemeth. Mother, wouldst thou truly lordship sanction in one so bereft of light? Yet, my purpose standeth unchanged. Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death. In the embrace of Messmer's flame.
Messmer was one of Queen Marika's many children who was unfortunately cursed at birth by a being only known as the Abyssal Serpent. Marika removed her son's eye and placed a seal there in its place to keep it away from him as best as she could. Messmer would eventually make a name for himself when he got older and made other allies who were also cursed at birth in their own way. A lot like General Gaius, who was an Albinoric, and probably my least favorite boss in Shadow of the Erdtree. Fuck you, buddy. Until one day his mother, who he remained fiercely loyal to, ordered him to slaughter all of the Hornsent in the Lands of Shadow since they didn't bear the light of grace. But at some point during the mission, Marika had completely cut contact with Messmer. He remained undeterred though and continued the mission for his mother, whom he loved so much. And as time passed, he made a home for himself inside of the Shadow Keep and stayed there, until he got word of a tarnished champion who entered the keep. And in a sense of duty to the Golden Order and his mother, he faces the tarnished in battle, until he is eventually pushed to his limit, and it is only then that he destroys the seal that his mother created for him, and lets his serpentine nature run wild. And like what I was saying earlier, this fight really feels like a dance. Right out the gate, he starts hitting you with a ton of spear and fire attacks, and then when he eventually brings the snake into the fray, the combos just get insane. And that is really what makes the fight so much fun. He doesn't have some insanely beefy health bar like his younger brother Radahn, or a second health bar like Malenia. It is just one extremely intense boss fight. And fighting him in his chamber at the top of the Shadow Keep with all the candles is such an awesome place to fight the face of the DLC. So, all in all, I believe Messmer has earned the title of the coolest boss inside of Elden Ring. So, those are my picks for the coolest fight in each one of these games. And like I mentioned earlier, let me know in the comments if you think anyone else deserved the spot that I shorted, because it seriously hurt only picking one from each game, so I'm curious what you guys think. And if you guys think that I fucked up choosing Dark Lurker over the Covetous Demon. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more banger content like this. I feel like I'm really starting to get the hang of this YouTube shit. But if you watched this long, thank you again so much, and I'll see you next time.